Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So the show today, Liz Koch. So Liz Koch has been working with the Psoas for 43 years. She is an international author, written several books on the Psoas, somatic educator, has a system called Core Awareness. She's also a conceptual artist, has bags and bags of experience with the Psoas, particularly in somatics in general. So Liz, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Mark.
So how did you get interested in the body? What was the beginning of your journey with this?
Well, I have one. And that always helps. But actually, I was a conceptual artist at the Boston Museum School of Fine Arts in the U.S. And I was brought there not because I'm an artist, but because I happened to have a show there, and they were very, I think they were looking for someone to stir the pot. And so the dean of the school asked me to teach. And so I was doing these what I would call expressions now, of rapping and in all kinds of mediums. And I was talking about form as being something other than solid and rigid, because it was an all-male sculpture department. And in that, I was influenced by people like Anna Halperin, who perceived dance and movement not as something happening on a stage, but happening in life. And so I was kind of in a happening state. And I happened to work one summer, because I didn't teach in the summer, at an opportunity to meet someone who said, hey, just come down and do a little stretching down at the river with me. And I did a pigeon pose. But what it brought up was that my perception changed. I have a history of scoliosis, kyphosis, lordosis, and probably psychosis. But in all that, as a young woman, I didn't perceive my body as something that was going to change. I was looking at it on the outside as a biodynamic expression. And the minute my perception changed, intentionally, I went, oh, wow, I need more of this. And so I ventured looking for someone, not a dance class, not a movements class. And in those years, there wasn't a lot out there. And so I found Bob Cooley. And Bob Cooley wrote a book called The Genius of Flexibility. He hadn't written it then, but he came out of a dance background who was now doing really what's called human potential at that time, or somatics now. And that was my entry into dropping the so-called conceptual art and making life conceptual art. Me, I'm the project. I'm the art form.
And the Psoas, where to begin? This is your specialist subject. Maybe like personally, what got you interested in this? Was there a particular moment, or was it part of that journey?
Yeah, it was part of that journey. Bob, when I entered into his class, was recognizing that all movement comes from the spine out to the fingers and toes, to the extremities, and that he recognized that why dancers injure themselves was because of this core tissue called psoas. And so he was just entering, exploring it. So we spent literally hours, not at the same time, but over 3 years, going into constructive rest, which is on your back, knees up, feet on the floor. And it's an intuitive position, but it was coined by Lulu Schweigart and Maple Todd in the 1930s as constructive rest. And it's not really so much, it is a rest position, but it's actually the construction part that's interesting, because it allows our bones to land and to interact with gravity. And the minute it does that, what I call extraneous neurological excitation of this tissue we call psoas starts to regulate. And it regulates because we're landed, because we're in our bones now. We know where ground is. We know where we land and locate. And so that was my entry. He introduced me to the psoas. And for me, my personal experience with that was that when I really landed, I recognized I was very young, in my early 20s, and I recognized that I kept jumping up and thinking someone was at the door, someone's, knocking, the phone's ringing, because at that time there were phones, and something was happening. And it took me a while to realize there is nothing happening. So what moves me out of constructive rest, to literally jump practically out of my skin? That's my journey into recognizing about the fear response and how terrified I was as a young woman.
So you felt really contacted that fear in your body that was there.
Yes, that moves us. That where we react or we have this impulse, and later we think, what was that about? But it was my interface between the sensory system, and then I spent literally years, entering that sensory system and marking or tracking different experiences within myself of sensation and what we think of as emotion and imagery and, the stories, but mostly cultivating the kinesthetic intelligence, the ability to actually nuance sensation.
Let's start at the beginning then with the psoas. So if someone said, just kind of what is it, where would you begin with that?
Well, I would begin with changing the language of body, because anatomically it's considered a muscle, but that is a false dogma. And so most people are under that as the impression of trying to understand psoas. So my life work has been to change the language, and I've been on this journey consciously for about 15 years or so. And only now with my new book have I articulated it to the point, because I think people are finally ready, and publishers are ready, to talk about changing the language of body. So my language of body is psoas, is the very core tissue of your organism, that it emerges out of what's called embryologically your midline or notochord or primitive streak, central nervous system. And it is a fluid, juicy tissue. It's filet mignon in animals. And it is what I call a messenger of the midline. I also call it an organ of perception, like the tongue. It's not a thing. It's not, it is a thing in the sense that you can parse the human organism and find psoas. But it's not something in fact, the more you can sense your psoas, the more dysfunctional it is. It's very elusive. It's very much to me like an organ. I don't go around sensing my organs unless I'm really focused in on them. Or I'm, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who has spent her life focusing on the organ.
For most of us, yeah. Maybe heart and lung, not so much the pancreas.
Right, but otherwise we don't go around, sensing organs all the time until something's wrong. And then we go, oh, I have a stomach ache. Oh, what did I eat? Or what happened? Or I'm upset.
Or
we go, oh, my kidneys are aching. Yeah, until there's a problem. So if you can sense your psoas, you probably have a problem with it. Okay.
And let's just place it anatomically for people, because it does have this mysterious quality, the deep core muscle. But it does, it is anatomically somewhere quite concrete, right? So maybe you could just sort of talk people through where it is anatomically.
Yes, it's literally the core of your being. So behind your navel. So if you look at the fetal curl or the primitive curl of a primal organism, and you're looking at that C shape, and you're looking at where the umbilicus is, it's right behind that. It's along that midline. In the biomechanical perspective, and I just want to say, people say it inserts into the 12th thoracic vertebrae, and I'd like to change the language of that, because I tell people that if someone inserted your psoas, then that's who was it? I'd like to know, because no one inserted your psoas. It emerges out of your, around the 12th thoracic vertebrae, possibly lower in your lumbar, and it flows at a diagonal from the spine to the leg and grows into the lesser trochanter, which, if you know where your greater trochanter is, on the outside of your hip, it's that big bone, and if you kind of visually track it, it's on the inside of the femur. So it goes from spine to femur.
And it
And
actually
it's
connects.
literally in the center. Yes.
Right. And it's connecting to all these important things, right? Like it's connecting right up to the diaphragm, and it's the lower back issues can be associated with it. So it kind of links into a lot of other issues and things with people's breathing, people's fight-flight response, back issues that may not be immediately obvious to people.
Well, yeah, it's
Yes,
everything. From an embryological point of view, everything comes from the midline. So all, the kidneys float on the psoas. All organs are in front of the psoas. So it's responsive tissue. That's why I call it the organ of perception. That it's such lush fluid tissue, and it's in the deepest bag of our connective tissue. So what Sue Hitzman has defined as the neurocore. So the sympathetic neurocore of the connective tissue world is the deepest bag that includes your central nervous system, your psoas, your kidneys, and your adrenals. It is survival. No one can fix your psoas. Okay? That's a mechanical model. That's a mechanistic view that you're a body with no soul and no center. But I think of the very center of your being from an embryological point of view. So as Jaap van der Wal, embryologist, the Dutch embryologist, has articulated to me and to others, is that, we're not made up of cells. We utilize cells to become. And the psoas is about self-actualization. Am I safe? Am I not safe? Am I coherent or am I not coherent?
I mean, are you still talking about the muscle as it would be recognized by an anatomist, or are you talking more metaphorically here now? I'm not quite clear which paradigm you're in.
I'm talking about realistically. I'm talking about in real time and space. The anatomist is not real. That's why Jaap van der Wal says it's a false dogma. Anatomy is a construct. It's a mechanical construct that was overlaid the human organism. It doesn't really exist. It's a paradigm that we use. There's nothing real there. There's tissue, and you can parse that tissue, and you can name it whatever you want. And when they parsed dry cadavers that were held in formaldehyde, they called it a muscle. But psoas is not a muscle as we think of external muscle about doing. It's about the core being of the human organism. As long as we look at body as an object, we have a problem, because body is not an object, it's a living process.
Yeah, so
it's a living system.
Sure.
Yeah, so we have to shift that conversation to the living system, and then we can really understand psoas. Otherwise, people who are coming out of a mechanical model don't know what to do with the psoas. They think it's a problem, they think they need to fix it. And that's like saying, what I tell my students is, I defy you to find a flower that you can make blossom by trigger pointing it, deep tissue work, massaging it, stretching it. You can't make a flower blossom that way. And you cannot make a human organism come into its fullness as a living system by antagonizing the psoas. It's like poking a caterpillar. The only thing the psoas can do is curl and protect itself.
So if people say, such and such has got a tight psoas, they need to stretch it. I mean, that doesn't sound like that's your paradigm at all.
No, because people don't understand what the psoas is telling us. That we have a tight psoas means that we think it's a thing that needs fixing. So you take it into somebody and have it fixed. If you understand you're a living organism and the psoas is what you perceive as tight, you might be looking at dryness, a lack of hydrating in the connective tissue. You might be looking at not a tight psoas or a short psoas. What you're looking at is an exhausted psoas. So now, when we think of exhaustion, we have to rethink what we do, because we're not going to try to make it stronger. We're not going to try to stretch it. And nobody ends up stretching their psoas because, one, if it's dry, you can't stretch dry tissue. It's not responsive. And two, psoas is more intelligent than that. It's doing something. It's actually a survival response. And so its expression of survival is about safety. And you can't stretch, palpate, trigger point, or massage that out of a person. You can only nourish a person to thrive. So thriving is what I'm really looking for. How do we thrive? And over 43 years, I've had this conversation numerous times. So it's something I'm very comfortable with in challenging our perception of body, because we are under the spell of anatomy, and unfortunately we haven't woke up yet. So one of my goals is to wake us up about that and change the language of body.
I mean, let me read from your website here. It says, the psoas is not merely a muscle. It's the primal messenger from the core of your being. The biointelligent tissue expresses your integrity on every level and may be perceived as the guardian of the hara, Japanese word, commonly referred to as the moving center. Located deep within your core, your psoas is the source of internal inner power. It feels like quite a lot to put on the psoas. And, you know, sometimes I hear this sort of muscle of the soul and this sort of semi-mystical terminology used for, you know, a piece of meat that goes through the middle of us, which may be extremely important aspect of the fight-flight response. But, I mean, this seems an almost sort of mystical approach to it.
I don't think so. I think that that's the way that people try to keep the dogma alive and their validation of looking at body as object. Because they have their own issues.
Well, I don't look at the body as an object. My entire career is based on, and life is based on body as process, you know, body as part of itself. So you're not hearing my challenge correctly, if that's how you hear it.
Okay, so yes, it is a piece of meat if you're, you know, eating psoas, but I would recommend never eating human psoas.
Does it taste better than filet mignon?
I just don't think it's going to be juicy enough. Let me put it that way.
So it's not juicy enough. What about a really, like, someone that's done all the trauma therapy and really, you know, lived in a sort of a Pacific island their whole life? Would they have a tasty psoas, do you think?
I don't know. I kind of don't want to go down that path. It gets pretty creepy. But, you know, cannibalism is something we've been really trained not to think about. So, let me say that it is such
Sorry, Liz, I went down inside out of that. My bad.
That's okay. That's okay. But it is part of the full body orgasm. So let me raise the bar here a little bit.
I think you've got everyone's attention now.
Your juicy psoas is about full body orgasm as well as the fear response. So I'm all about nourishing psoas, not so much eating people, but you know, the dynamic expressive psoas. So when we look at the organism as process, then we have to switch the understanding that it's not mystical. The people who coined it, this muscle of the soul, was the Taoist healers. Okay, so that's an Eastern philosophy, which of course Western medicine poo-poos, but we also know has a lot of validation. I mean, let's face it. You know, the Asians, the entire, you know, Oriental philosophy understood without anatomy the inner organs of the body and their flows. I mean, you know, so they got something going on there. But so looking at it from that point of view, what that really means is that in anatomy, all tissue from the spine forward flexes and all tissue from the spine back extends. Therefore, psoas is a flexor. It's a flexing muscle. But that is a paradigm. If you change to the embryological paradigm, which is not woo-woo, but science, and you look at someone like the Dutch embryologist, Jaap van der Wal, who was has all the credentials. He's an MD. He was a professor for many, many years. He just, retired recently. And he taught anatomy to Olympic athletes for 10 years. And he tells me it's a false dogma, that I don't feel like I'm going into some vague conversation. We're talking about difference of paradigm. So the difference in the paradigm is that the embryological model is that the cells organize around an axis. And that axis is kind of your north and south pole. And that's where the psoas emerges out of. So yes, all tissue is wholly sacred. The expression of the organism is that. But we're really looking at a misunderstanding of psoas from being a messenger of the midline. In other words, it informs us of certain things. It informs us. It changes the way we look at body from an object to a process. So when someone shows up and they have they come to me because, hey, I know something about the psoas. What I'm looking at is the process they're already in. Where is their core expression? So we change from looking at a structure to looking at the expression. And once you go to the expression, then it's easier to understand psoas within the context of this what's called biomorphic movement, the expressions of all living systems. It's part of that. So you have to change the paradigm to understand psoas. As long as you stay in the more anatomical way, it doesn't fit in that paradigm. And I spent a long time, because I'm not, in the medical world, I'm not, a therapist, in kind of understanding psoas. But I approached psoas through a somatic exploration, and I started to language it differently. And it was only when I sat at Yelp's kitchen table, and here's the scientist telling me about gesture. And I'm going, oh, I call it expression. I'm being validated for what I understand somatically by a scientist who says when you change the paradigm and you use the embryological model, all of a sudden psoas shows up as something of a kind of informant. It's informing you. It's relating you to ground, and it's telling you, are you here on the earth in space and time? And that's proprioception. So it's very proprioceptively, that's what it's informing us about. And if we stop thinking of it as a structure, because then we have to stop thinking of this spinal column as a column and recognize we have no columns, we have no floors, there are no pelvic floors. There are no vaginal walls. There are no roofs of your mouth. Those are words that language object.
Yeah, but they're not based on nothing, Liz. I mean, I think you're taking this argument far too far. I mean, I mean, really.
Sorry.
Yes, I really get that anatomy's cut out. And anatomists create things by cutting them out. You don't see. I've cut up dead bodies. I've cut up cadavers, and you don't see a neat biceps in the same way. Say, but there's nothing there. I mean, they're talking about something when they talk about the biceps. Let's just talk about another muscle that doesn't have the same mysticism attached.
Right.
Right. There's something going on.
There is a psoas. Yeah, there is a psoas, but we defined it in a certain way. I think it's the same way as connective tissue. For many years, they took connective tissue out and threw it away, and now we're studying it. So if we studied psoas from a different paradigm, it's not that it doesn't exist, but you don't find its value by looking at dead cadavers. You look at its value by recognizing its expression, because it's kind of like saying I can understand love by cutting my heart out. Or having open heart surgery, I'll open my heart. Well, no, you won't. I mean, actually, it does kind of involve that, right? Because you have a death-like experience. But psoas is more expressive than that. So, you can have a tiny little woman, dead cadaver, who has a plump psoas, and you can have a big, huge guy who has a little skinny psoas. Your tissue is shaped by what you do. So studying it in a dead cadaver only gives you certain information. Now, we do know things like...
you on this. It seems like you're pushing an agenda of, anti kind of anatomical, which I'm with you on. Gary Carlson was on the show.
So ask me a different question. We'll go somewhere else.
So what does it do then? If it's about process, let's talk more about that, because I feel like that's what people are interested in is its role in the fight flight. What makes it plump or not plump, as you say. What's its role?
So what I think the psoas is messaging is whether, on a very simple way, is am I safe, am I not safe? And safety is not external, it's internal, right? So the internal sensory system. So it's about the deep proprioception of the organism, specifically skeletal. So I think it's very intimate with your bones. So when a person doesn't sense themselves in their bones, doesn't feel the resonance or frequency in the bone, doesn't feel landed or what we call grounded, then your psoas is actually informing you that you're not safe, because it's very primal. It's part of the reptilian brain. And so it's informing us about locating, just like an animal, if you're disorganized as an animal, you'll be eaten. It's on that level. So it's very primal, and you can't control it through the mental, conceptual framework of, controlling your quad. You can't do it that way. So in understanding that it's informing us, it also informs us about neurological coherency. So how do all this, what we have defined as all these different nervous systems, how do they work in orchestration? How does the enteric brain work with the heart field and works with the central nervous system and works with the peripheral sensory system and works with the autonomic nervous system. So it's telling us a lot about fight or flight and freeze, but it's also telling us about rest, digest, and repair. So the more nourished you are, the healthier your cell. And it doesn't message anything. It has nothing to say when you're safe but safe internally. In other words, when you can locate and know where you are in space and time, when you have good proprioception, then you will your psoas is. And then the other piece that happens is our speed of life and the things that we do can dry the core out. We spend a lot of time creating density in the core, overstabilizing the core. And that's why I go off onto these tangents, because it's actually the languaging that encourage us to do that. But if we understood that psoas is actually expressive, we would do different things to support a healthy core. So core steel, core tension, core support is actually using that old model of shoring up the column. Whereas I'm suggesting that we're more like a caterpillar or a living river, the spine is, and that it's actually this lush territory that we want to nourish through rest, through micro movement, through turning towards our kinesthetic and developing the kinesthetic awareness that helps us remember or hear the messages from inside that are coming through us, so we don't ignore them or override them, things like that.
So are these, when you say, you have workshops and you work with the psoas, is this what you're talking about? You're doing interoceptive work, you're doing sort of deep rest, micro movements. Is this the sort of toolkit you're working with the psoas? I
am. Those are all great things. And then I'm increasing proprioception. So I'm getting people in their bones. I'm articulating joints, because we know that the joint has the proprioceptor that not only tells us range of motion, but tells us location. And when you have certain joints specifically, like the ankle is where we shift from the vertical to the horizontal. So that proprioceptor for many people is not turned on, so to speak, or not really connected. And the moment it is, they start to feel themselves and their psoas, so-called, relaxes.
So in terms of, can someone feel the psoas? I mean, I've heard you say two different things about this now. So I've heard you on the one hand say it's a kind of unconscious muscle that we can't control. But is it something?
Well, you can sense it. You can sense it, yeah. But it's subtle. It's like can you sense a cloud? You can, but it's subtle, right? You don't go around. But for example, some dancers have steel rods for psoas. They're like a cable. So we're talking about sensory. I mean, you can touch it. You can go behind all the organs and poke it. So you can literally locate it. But that gets a reaction because it is a primal tissue. So it's like exactly like a caterpillar. If you poke the psoas, it will curl. You'll get a reaction out of it.
I've done various exercises of trying to identify the psoas, or dragging the legs up, and then kind of deep body work like rolfing, where people have said they've been working directly on the psoas. I mean, are these things you support, or you think this is not a good idea because of this reactivity you talked about?
I think it's a poor idea. I don't think we can fix another human being. And when I watched when that became, and I'm old enough to have watched that all develop, and the idea of restructuring the human being. And I understand. I've had, in fact, there's 2 hours of Tom Myers and I hashing out the manipulation, non-manipulation conversation on my website. But I will say that I think it behooves people to recognize that you don't need fixing. You don't need correcting. You need connection. And the connection to core is a development of what's called self-actualization. There's a beautiful work out of Denmark, Liz Koch's work. And when I think years ago, and I don't know if I came to this and then found her work or I heard it from her work, is, the psoas is like the if you think of all developmental phases of a young child, they're developing, and it's coordinated with their emotional development. So when we crawl, in a way, it's a form of articulation and of separation and of recognizing that I'm different from my mother, and so psoas is about full actualization. So someone can't fix your psoas, but what you can do is hear its message, and then you know what's needed. So, for example, a lot of people who have tight psoas actually have disruption in their pelvis. So they might have torn ligaments, they might have hypermobility, they might have, cracked their bone or broken their coccyx, or they may have been kicked in the butt, or they may have been abused, or they may have, and that is what the psoas is messaging, is that they are not internally coherent or safe. That has been disrupted.
Heard you say before, don't shoot the messenger. So it's like,
that's right.
The psoas is tight. It's like telling you, like, hey, maybe you don't feel safe. Maybe something's going on in your life. Maybe there's a problem here, and it's just sort of just try and work directly on that. It's to work on a symptom and not the cause. Is that kind of where you're coming from with that?
Well, kind of. I mean, constructive rest is a powerful, place to begin, because getting into constructive rest does help you land and locate. And so, for example, what I tell people, when you're in constructive rest and you really relax there, you sense your bones, you feel very grounded, very, coherent. And you roll over and you get up and you start walking, and that tightness all comes back. Then you know you have a disruption in your proprioception. You know that there's a ligament torn or overstretched or injured, when a joint that's injured. And the psoas isn't telling us about that. But if you do what I did, which was I went into constructive, I had both, but I was in constructive rest, and I didn't feel at peace. I felt my fear. I felt my nervous system. I felt how frayed or more, how disrupted my nervous system was, how sympathetic my responses were. Then we're looking at the nourishment piece, the nourishing the kidneys, nourishing the tissue, nourishing, and the hydration of connective tissue through those micro movements is entering that fluid world, and the fluid world is pre-nervous system. So it's a delicious, Emily Conrad's work, a continuum. Beautiful. She and I had the opportunity to work with her, both as her as my mentor, but also we co-taught. And, this idea of nourishing tissue allows, it's kind of like going back to the idea of a plant or a tree. What nourishes it to become its fully size and full expression is the elements of life. And so we go back to those elements of life.
I mean, is constructive rest something you recommend for people? I mean, that's kind of one I've got a lot from Alexander Technique and Feldenkrais. There's different systems that use it, as you say, maybe going back to Todd. I mean,
and both of those are very proprioceptive.
Yeah.
They both, Alexander and Feldenkrais, both really focused on proprioception. And so I agree, proprioception is the key to a healthy psoas. It's good proprioception.
I was just with Julie Martin, who's a well-known yoga teacher, and there's a sort of quiet revolution happening in yoga where people have gone from stretching to feeling, and there's a lot more of a somatic approach now where people are lying on the floor and feeling into these small movements and working with proprioception rather than just pulling on things. And it's a kind of bit of a revelation in the yoga world, and I've been like, well, yeah, well done for catching up, guys. Nearly 100 years behind the somatics world, but round of applause. But I was happy to see that catching on in the yoga world now. And it's not just Julie, there's Gary Carter and all sorts of other people who are working that way.
Right. So the somatic world, the sensory system, the deep proprioception helps us find, for example, in yoga, helps us locate. So the location isn't about just putting the body into a asana and hoping you find it. It's actually the relationship of locating from the center. So if we think about we're a spine-based organism, we come from the spine out to find our arms and legs, then we're never torquing the pelvis, which then doesn't get the psoas involved. So it's not about pulling on the psoas. It's about locating in our bones, and that frees the psoas to not be involved. It's really no different than the way we sit in cars. And of course, here in the States, people drive a lot more than in Europe. But how our car seat is designed, the chairs that we sit on, the ergonomics is a big part of psoas. Because if you're sitting in a car and the seat is tipped back and you're falling, psoas is part of the falling response. So, if I fall backwards, I roll. If I fall forwards, I roll. But if I'm suspended in a fall and I'm not actually falling, and I'm engaging this tissue all the time I'm driving.
And
then I get out and I'm stressed and my back hurts,
Yeah. So in terms of what's leading to kind of these psoas issues we see then, so it's you mentioned the general speed of life, the stress of life, all the ex-sitting, not very much moving. I mean, what else is involved in some of these issues?
Birth is a big piece. What I think of as the industrial birth complex is a industrialized idea of birth. So the baby follows the mother's psoas down through the birth canal if it gets to go through the birth canal, and the trauma that is showing up in people through their birth experience is part of why we come in depleted in the first place, and why more and more human beings are being born in the startle response, both through the Doppler, through the vibrational field. Psoas is very responsive. So as a living organism, you are responsive. Every cell is responsive. So it's not just psoas, it's the whole organism is responsive, and psoas is the messenger of that. So I'm not trying to put too much on psoas. It's just that it's more about being than it is about doing. So basically, you don't use your psoas for any being, doing activities. It's not something you do. It's just being. You're just a being, and the beingness of you is about how you're responding to the world and how you receive information and how you communicate information. So it's kind of a call and response, us to the earth. And the more we're disconnected from the earth, I think the more we see this deep level of incoherency in the organism. And I'm actually not too big on the trauma piece of it, because I really believe if we've stripped every bit of trauma and defense from a human organism, it's not a good thing. It's actually that the organism needs nourishment, because living systems know how to respond when given the right nourishment. And so that can be different for each person. But so I'm really looking at the nourishment piece rather than trying to, again, fix the psoas. That allows the whole system to blossom. And then psoas is, no longer giving those messages of low back pain. Low back pain has a lot to do with rigidity and defenses, not just ergonomics and how much people sit, but it's also a strategy for survival that may have started much earlier with a living fetus, with both trauma in the womb and birth trauma. So I teach with Anna Verval, who's Dutch, and brings Womb to World, the journey that shapes our life, and how birth shapes us. And then I work with these primal responses called fetal curl and warding off. And by playing with those responses, and I talk about them in my new book, Stalking Psoas, Embodying Your Core Intelligence, and they're in core awareness as well. When we begin to recognize that what we're looking at is someone who's not, you don't have to change the structure, you have to support the organism, then we start to see how these expressions, or what Yap calls gestures, are meaningful to us. We see the person curled over as actually returning so that they can refine themselves, they can relocate. And we find the person who's warding off as in a startle response, and kind of, that's an adaptation that needs to complete itself. So we're looking at how do I complete these expressions? And I spend time in my workshops showing how these are very powerful. They affect your nervous system. They change it. They allow it to return to a parasympathetic state.
So it's less sort of, there's a view, isn't there, that people say things like your trauma is stored in your psoas. And it sounds like you're not so much supporting that view. and systems like TRE, which are supposed to be releasing the trauma in the psoas.
Well, I know David. David came to me before he developed his work and talked to me about psoas. So, and I've talked with David years ago, and I think what he's offering is a very powerful medicine for people who are first responders, people who are in a war zone, and people who their trauma is not theirs. In other words, if I'm a first responder and I'm seeing trauma of other people's lives every single day, how do I digest that when I come home at night? How do I wake up and go back into work the next day? Where I disagree with him, and he knows it, is that the average person, and certainly a yoga class, does not need trauma release work. First of all, nobody goes through a trauma response with strangers. Nobody gives birth as mammals around a group of people with lights and we don't make love on the freeway. There's just, it doesn't, I mean, you can, but it's certainly not possible.
Frowned upon, let's say.
Hard to focus, hard to be open,
but actually, I actually get what you're saying, that when we're involved, I don't want people around when I'm taking a shit either. Like when I'm involved in sort of making love or, any biological process like that, being surrounded by strangers and bright lights doesn't help.
Yeah, it's really simple, actually, what I'm talking about. It's not very out there. It's just really practical common sense.
Okay, and I mean, what, is there any particular areas of your work that you're passionate about that you want to talk about? Is there sort of particular aspects you haven't covered that you think, wow, this is really juicy? I mean, other than full body orgasm, which we have to come back to, obviously.
Okay. Well, I am passionate about changing the language, and that's what you were saying. You thought I was being kind of, fighting you on it, and I'm not. I'm just passionate on how much I believe that the languaging for those of us who are therapists, who are educators, who are teachers, who are working with people, we're the place that can begin to change this paradigm. And there's so much hope in the paradigm. If I come and I can't, people come to me and they say, do you think my psoas can change? Do you think like I can heal my, low back or whatever? And I say, are you still breathing? Is your blood still? Because cells are constantly changing. So therefore, change is inevitable. In other words, as a living process, we are self-healing, self-organizing, self-referencing in relationship to the earth. So when we allow the earth to inform us, when we become grounded. So I think this whole idea of re-entering this conversation is part of the decolonization of the mechanistic world. And I can say that I believe that the Industrial Revolution is over and we're on to the information age. And so we have to recognize that we're recognizing things in a different way. But part of what we're working with is our disconnect, our disassociation from the earth. So I think that's a big piece. And that when we land and locate and really sense ourselves here, that is the somatic, embodiment piece, then the organism begins to find very creative, very resilient ways of living and finding solutions and interacting, and the hostilities and the reaction. All of that is basically we live in a very sympathetic culture. So I think it behooves us all to participate in changing the language of body, to look for ways to see that we are we are the earth. We are the environment. We are a force of nature.
I find myself, there's something sort of sad and exhausted in me today. And I was just in the center of town, kind of rushing back to do this interview. And there's something I had to take care of in the center of town. And there was something about the sort of fast, concrete life of disconnected from the earth. Like literally, I'm not touching the earth. There's this layer of concrete and there's this speed, and the center of town is nearly all shops. We just take that for granted. The center of a city is a consumer area. And there was something about rushing through the area of town at this kind of speed of life to get up the hill and I just something in me just feels exhausted and sad by it all. And it's no surprise to me that the body freaks out in different ways. when presented with these huge disconnects, like being surrounded by strangers, And then there's the little relaxing when I come back home and, my wife works nights, she kind of opens the door and she's like, oh, hi, welcome back. Have you got a call? Okay, I'll get off the internet. Do you need a cup of tea? And it's like, oh, okay, a little bit of community, a little bit of homecoming. And there's something in this at the moment for me, which I'm feeling the tremendous kind of sadness of. Is this making any sense to you?
Absolutely, Mark. And, I feel like there is a global soul. In other words, we are a species, and we are one species among many species. So not only is there a disconnect, calling the animals to counsel, we don't recognize our animal nature, and we don't understand that we're one species, and we don't connect with other species of all different beings that are living and responding to our behavior. And so there is a very disassociative event going on. So you could say the human organism is deeply traumatized through our historical stories, through our cultural stories, through the trauma we've all endured that is still flowing through our cells and our molecular beings. So yeah, I think your response is healthy and normal.
Yeah, there's something about feeling in that environment which is like, ouch. Okay. Well, I'm looking at your website here. There's lots of good things on it. If people have heard a video play a couple of times, that was from your website. There's a nice little video on there. And you've got this new book, Stalking Wild Psoas, which is there, embodying your core intention. How many buzzwords can you fit in there, Liz? You've got embodying, core, wild. This is like buzzword bingo right now.
It is. That's where I said I've been talking about Stalking Wild Psoas for years. The first place I ever taught Stalking Wild Psoas was New York City. And the reason I went there to teach this workshop was I knew that people in New York, one, loved other people, because you wouldn't live in New York if you didn't like people, because there's not much anything else than humans.
Good theory. I like it.
Yeah, so that's one. You have to like other people to really actually hang out there. And two, people like to play. And there's a certain freedom there. Somebody runs down the street, swearing, nobody, it doesn't ruffle anybody's feathers. They're just all like, okay, whatever. And so I brought Stalking Wild there because I wanted to start having a dialogue around undomesticating the psoas, undomesticating our human responses. We're terrified of the wild. And if you look up the word wild, it's all about losing control and being crazy, and people have that deeply embedded. Our minds are colonized, I will say, and so when you start to work with this on a deep somatic level, you recognize the fears that are deeply embedded in us, not to be wild, not to feel anything of nature, not to feel connected to Earth. Earth is dirty. It's bad. So that takes us right to orgasms, right? So there's all this stuff that's right there. And the other end of it is, okay, self-expression, yes, we can do whatever we want, but that's still part of the story. It's not the animal nature. And so how do we find that wildness that is actually what I think of as creativity, is innovation, the innovating organism. As far as getting the words right, I was really trying to hone my message. And it wasn't buzzwords to me. Those are words I've been using for years. And now the timing is right.
Stalking.
The first time I actually did Stalking Wild.
Sexy word. What stalking? I mean, that's if you're hunting an animal, you're stalking it. So is the idea here sort of looking for something mysterious? It's a very sexy way you've put it. Stalking Wild Psoas. And at the moment, it's a very sexy title for a book about psoas muscle.
Yeah, well, it's not a muscle; it's a messenger, and it's a wild being. Okay, so the first time I did it was in London. I was the keynote speaker for the International Bowen Conference, and I shared my keynote speaking with Michelle O'Donnell. And I have to say, people didn't know what to think because they thought I was going to talk about this muscle. And I brought this whole, visual and story about rediscovering ourselves as living organisms. And people were like, and that was in 2010.
There's another.
So I've been talking about it a long time. So this is a culmination of my work, I would say.
Okay. Well,
not my open.
Everyone else is catching up on the words. And there's another book in here, Mother, Maiden, Crone, and the picture looks like the top of a stocking with a garter belt attached. The pleasure playlist, it says. Tell us about that.
Yes, that is three of us. I'm the crone. And we put the book together for women with a maiden, with a mother, and the crone, with the idea of a pleasure playlist. And when we did it, people had playlists, right? Mm-hmm. What are your favorite songs? And so we decided what were the favorite ways to feel sensual, to feel pleasure, because sex is often not actually connected to the sensory system, to stalking or tracking our own pleasure. It's based on scintillation. So when you go into this sexuality for men and women, we're looking at where is pleasure. A pleasure can be the sense of a strawberry, a ripe, sun-ripened, lush strawberry on the tip of your tongue. That is pleasure that is part of that we have shut down in ourselves because of the whole cultural story. So I guess the best way to say this is I've gone underneath the cultural, historical, into the primal understanding of psoas and understanding the expression of a full body orgasm is a wave that flows all the way through your central channel or your column. But I like to think of it as more as your living river or your axis or your primitive street, or coming up with some new languaging around the very core of your being. Mm. And when that wave is there, we feel pleasure from the tips of our toes to the tip of our tongue, from the top of our head to the bottom of our tail. It's a full sensory experience.
Okay, and this is all on coreawareness.com, a nice website with different books and articles and different things on there, and also people that practice in your kind of line of work from around the world, right? They're on there too?
There's a community there. There's podcasts that I've done with various professionals in different avenues that we weave the relationship of psoas to that particular interest. So you'll find a lot of there is a conversation with Jaap Vanderbilt, for example, or Tom Myers, or there are all kinds of people from around the world, and weaving psoas into. So we're not looking at this isolated thing, but how it expresses itself. Through the eyes, through pelvic, the coherent pelvis, the ability for the pelvis to float in gravity rather than be held in some superficial idea of posture. Yeah, so lots of free education there.
Lots of good stuff there, videos and all sorts. Okay, so do you have a parting message about the body for all our listeners, Liz?
I don't. I think this was great, and I thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for your time. Much appreciated. Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodyfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodyfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodyfacilitator.com website, There's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook. There, bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.